we're onto something here, aren't we? There's some interesting points developing. The point is that entrepreneur relief is a relief given to individuals. It's not given to the shareholders in the company completely. So if you do have a company that's going to be sold for, let's say 10 million, and you have a husband and a wife, it can't be beyond your wit to say, well, let's share this, divide the shares equally so that half, 2 lots of 5 million, job done. There's no tax on a transfer of shares from husband to wife or wife to husband. No capital gains tax, no inheritance tax. So perfectly easy to do, perfectly easy to do. Is there any anti-avoidance legislation that the revenue could invoke saying you only did that to get entrepreneur relief? No, there isn't. There is no legislation of that nature. So perfectly done. Supposing it's 20 million. Supposing it's 20 million and you've got husband and wife and 2 children. Sounds like 4 people to me. 4 5 sound like 20. Can you do that? Well, yes, you can. You have to be careful, of course, now, because making a transfer from father to sons, let's say, is not automatically exempt. There is no exemption from either inheritance tax or capital gains tax for that transaction. So you need to make sure you're not triggering some kind of horrific tax charge in doing it, but you shouldn't be triggering a horrific tax charge in doing that. The horrific thing you are doing is giving the ungrateful little swines the money. That is, what are they going to do with it? They're going to grab the money, sell out, suddenly you've got 2 kids with £5 million each. What are you going to do? You're going to grab hold of them, twist their arm up their back and say, give me my money back, sonny boy. It wasn't really yours. At which point, if the revenue get wind of that, they'll be grabbing hold of you, sticking your arm up against your back and saying, give us more tax, probably with interest and penalties. So it's a very dangerous game to play. If you were minded to give your children the money anyway, then obviously it's a very tempting way of doing it and minimising capital gains tax. Because for every pound of extra entrepreneur relief you get, at the current levels, you're saving 18%. £5 million at 18% is £900,000. It's a lot of money, a lot of money to be saved there. So while we're thinking about entrepreneur relief, let's think of something else. What kind of disposals qualify for entrepreneur relief? Well, I've sort of alluded to it in very, very general terms, But actually the legislation talks about making a disposal which is a material disposal of business assets, which is your business, your partnership interest or your shares in your company. That's a material disposal of business assets. It also talks about an associated disposal. What is an associated disposal? Well, an associated disposal is most easily illustrated by way of example. You have your client who owns the shares in a company, which is a trading company, so all that qualifies, all that's fine, but the shares aren't worth anything. Nobody wants to buy the damn shares. He can't make a gain on the shares. But what he's got is a property which the company trades out of. He owns the widget making factory. And a developer is sniffing round, and if he can sell the widget making factory, he'll make some real money. The shares are never going to make him any money. How can he get entrepreneur relief in respect to the sale of the factory, the property which is used for the purpose of the company's trade? Well, he can, providing he qualifies under the rules for making an associated disposal. And what's he got to do? What he has got to do is he's got to make his associated disposal, the factory, in conjunction with making a material disposal and withdrawing from the business. Now, what does that mean in English? Very, very difficult concepts here, so bear with me. People, I've heard them say it, and they are wrong. People will sometimes say to you, a material disposal is some kind of quantitative test. You only make a material disposal if you dispose of, an amount. It's got to be half, or almost all, or at least 10%, or all sorts of crazy nonsense gets bandied around. And I use the words crazy nonsense advisedly, because a material disposal is not a quantitative test. It is a qualitative test. It is defined. What is a material disposal is defined. A disposal of shares in a company is a material disposal. There is no quantity implied or required by the legislation. So your hero, even if he knows perfectly well that nobody wants to buy his shares in his company, he could engineer a material disposal simply by giving some shares to his son or settling some shares on a trust for his son. One share would do. There is no quantitative test. Very important point. What he then has to do is, at the same time, dispose of the widget making factory, and at the same time take steps to withdraw from the business. Now, what does withdraw from the business mean? The revenue sort of accept that if you are disposing of shares and if you are taking a less active role, it doesn't mean you've got to resign your directorship. It doesn't mean you've got to stop working. But it doesn't mean you've got to retire. But if you can point to the fact that you are taking a less active role, that Sonny Boy is now coming through and is being given more responsibility, and you are going to work a few less hours, that would be sufficient to get within the rules. So, hugely important point. If you've got entrepreneur relief, often the prize that you want it against is the property, not the shares. So massively important that you satisfy the rules for an associated disposal. Suppose you've got trust. Happens all the time, doesn't it? You find family companies that are owned, there's a trust being bunged in along the way for some reason, usually inheritance tax planning. How does that work? Can trustees get entrepreneur relief? The answer is yes, they can. There's nothing to stop trustees from getting entrepreneur relief. But they will only get entrepreneur relief if they are the right kind of trust with the right kind of beneficiary doing the right thing. What do I mean by that? Well, they've got to have 5% of the shares. The beneficiary has got to have an interest in possession. What does that mean? It means it can't be a discretionary trust. It means there has got to be a person who has the right to receive the income from the shares, or at least 5% of the shares. So you need the right kind of trust, right kind of beneficiary, enough shares, and the beneficiary, yes, you've guessed it, he has got to be either a director or an employee. If you've got those, the trustees will get entrepreneur relief. So another angle there. It is quite possible to settle shares on trust and get entrepreneur relief. I think that's enough on entrepreneur relief for the moment. We might come back to it later. So I've got a few more things to say before we stop for tea. Now, national insurance contributions. Big point here. What is the big point? The big point is the jobs tax. I ask you rhetorically, at what point does employers' national insurance contributions become a job tax?
When is the election?
Well, yeah, quite. Yes. It seems to me that when employers' national insurance contributions are 12.8%, oh no, that's not jobs tax, that's just national insurance contributions. And they go from 12.8 to 13.8, and suddenly that extra one is a jobs tax, which I find, well, political, let's say. And what has our coalition government been saying, or what did the Conservative element of the coalition government start saying, and it's continued to be said? It is that we will stop the jobs tax. This jobs tax is an outrage, we will stop it. Vote for us, you won't get the jobs tax. Look at the screen. What are the rates of national insurance? What did I say earlier? It was proposed by Darling that they'd go up in 2 0.5% jumps. It was then accelerated that it would be a 1% jump, effective from the 6th of April 2011, and lo and behold, that's what the screen says. What's happened to this jobs tax that they've stopped? It's there. The point is the headline rates are going up by 1% across the board from next April. Darling's measure is coming.